In the annals of Rome, Tiberius Caesar Augustus stands as one of history's most haunting paradoxes. To some, he was the stern general who secured the empire's northern borders and brought stability after Augustus's long reign. To others, he was the man who turned the greatest empire on earth into his private nightmare. Few rulers begin their story so promisingly, and fewer still end it in such darkness. When Tiberius assumed the purple in 14 AD, Rome sighed with relief. The empire had seen decades of bloodshed, civil wars, and dangerous succession crises. Now, Augustus's adopted son, an experienced commander with victories in Germania and along the Danube, seemed the perfect heir. Here was a man who despised waste, who shunned unnecessary wars, who had walked in the mud with his legions and earned their loyalty. His stern, almost reluctant demeanor was praised as a mark of integrity. The people expected a reign of discipline, frugality, and order. But Tiberius was never entirely comfortable beneath the laurels of power. Behind the marble busts and triumphal processions, his life had been shaped by a series of personal wounds. He lost his beloved younger brother, Drusus, early in life, a death that scarred him deeply. He was forced to abandon his first wife, Vipsania, the only woman he seems to have truly loved, in order to marry Julia, Augustus's daughter. Julia was infamous for her scandalous affairs, and their union was less a marriage than a political trap. Tiberius withdrew from her with cold disdain, his bitterness hardening into mistrust of nearly everyone around him. Even in his early years, he bore the air of a man ill at ease with joy. Ancient writers described him as grave, brooding, quick to anger, but slow to forgive. He could command soldiers in battle, but he struggled to command his own heart. Roman society, with its obsession with dignity and stoic self-control, rarely allowed space for grief, yet Tiberius carried his silently, like cracks running through marble visible only when the light hit them at certain angles. Rome at first ignored these shadows. The Senate, relieved that the machinery of empire continued to turn smoothly, applauded his early restraint. He lowered taxes, avoided costly wars, and honored Augustus's policies. To the ordinary citizen, the transition of power seemed seamless. Proof that Rome's experiment in empire could survive beyond the charisma of its founder. But those who knew Tiberius more intimately, his generals, his household, even members of the imperial court, began to notice small fissures. He drank heavily, perhaps to drown his grief. He brooded over insults, real or imagined. He grew suspicious of praise, interpreting it as manipulation. The very qualities that made him disciplined in war, his caution, his refusal to act impulsively, curdled in politics into hesitation and mistrust. It is tempting to believe that monsters are born fully formed, but Tiberius was not. He began as a man marked by sorrow and a sense of alienation. What history would remember as cruelty may have started as withdrawal. What would later explode into paranoia may have begun as loneliness. His reign is the story of what happens when those cracks widen, when grief, bitterness, and suspicion metastasize within a man who holds absolute power. By the time the empire realized it, it was too late. For the first decade of his rule, Tiberius wore the mask of a competent emperor. From the outside, his reign looked stable, even admirable. He governed frugally, mindful of the empire's treasury, and avoided the reckless military adventures that had drained Rome's coffers in the past. His respect for the Senate, at least in appearances, seemed to restore a measure of dignity to that weary institution. To many Romans, he was not Augustus reborn, but he was steady, cautious, and that seemed enough. But beneath the surface, the man behind the purple was already unraveling. Those closest to him began to detect a growing bitterness, a gnawing disillusionment. Tiberius had never wanted to be emperor. Augustus's choice had been born less of affection than necessity. Augustus's favored heirs had died young, leaving Tiberius, the reluctant soldier, as the only option. That knowledge weighed on him. Every ceremony, every honor the Senate lavished upon him was shadowed by the thought that he had been chosen by default. His grief only deepened in 23 AD, when his son Drusus, his last hope for a loyal heir, died suddenly, perhaps poisoned. Whether the rumors of foul play were true or not, Tiberius believed them. The loss shattered what remained of his trust in the people around him. The man who once had marched at the head of legions now withdrew into himself, increasingly suspicious, increasingly cold. Rome still saw an emperor, but those close to him saw a grieving father turning into a paranoid recluse. The death of Drusus was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political turning point. Without his son, Tiberius had no anchor left in the world of family or succession. His marriage to Julia had long since collapsed in scandal, and his bond with Vipsania was a memory the state had forbidden him to keep. The emperor, who once represented continuity for Rome, now drifted in isolation, a solitary figure whose private despair began to corrode public duty. Historians note that during these years, Tiberius increasingly retreated from public appearances. The Senate still functioned, laws were passed, taxes collected, but the emperor's presence became ghostly, felt more through letters than through speeches. He no longer relished the spectacle of rule, the grand theatre of Roman power. The man who had once been forced into the spotlight by Augustus now longed for the shadows. And yet, to the ordinary Roman citizen, the empire still worked. Grain flowed into the city, the borders held firm, and the treasury remained full. For most, life continued unchanged. But behind the facade of stability, a silent transformation was taking place. The cautious general was hardening into the brooding emperor of rumor, the ruler whose suspicion turned into policy, whose grief began to seep into the very machinery of the state. Rome did not yet know it, but the mask was slipping. In 26 AD, Tiberius made the decision that would forever define his reign. He left Rome. Officially, it was framed as a retreat for health and rest, a withdrawal from the constant pressures of empire. In reality, it was the beginning of something far darker. He chose the island of Capri, off the Bay of Naples, as his refuge. To most Romans, Capri was a place of mythic beauty, a rocky jewel rising out of turquoise waters, its cliffs sheer and unforgiving, its caves echoing with stories of nymphs and sea gods. The poet Virgil had written of its enchantment, and sailors whispered that the island held sacred power. For Tiberius, however, Capri offered something more practical: isolation. It was defensible, difficult to approach without detection, and far removed from the political intrigues of Rome. On this island, he built not one villa, but 12. Each was lavishly constructed, a monument to excess in stone and marble. Their ruins still crown the cliffs today, stark reminders of the empire's wealth and its corruption. From these villas, the emperor governed in absentia. The Senate continued to meet in Rome, but its decrees meant little without Tiberius's approval. Real power now radiated from Capri, carried by letters that condemned men to death with a few strokes of ink. Yet Capri was not just a political command post. It was a stage. Tiberius used the island to construct an alternate world, one in which his desires, not Roman law or custom, were supreme. The villas became laboratories for indulgence, hidden theatres for fantasies that could never be staged in Rome itself. Ancient writers described them as filled with sculptures, paintings, and imported luxuries from Greece and the East. Walls that might once have displayed noble victories or scenes of gods were instead adorned with art that left even hardened Romans unsettled. To outsiders, Capri soon acquired a sinister reputation. Senators and envoys summoned there often returned shaken, if they returned at all. Servants whispered of strange rituals, of games and spectacles that mocked the innocence of childhood and the dignity of adulthood alike. For many, the island came to symbolize the collapse of the imperial image. Where Augustus had built Rome into a city of marble, Tiberius was transforming an island paradise into a fortress of shadows. It is telling that Romans began to speak of Capri not as a retreat, but as an exile. Their emperor had abandoned them, retreating into a world of cliffs and caves where his paranoia could fester unchecked. To rule at a distance was already strange. To turn distance into a stage for decadence was unprecedented. Capri became not just Tiberius's sanctuary, but his cage, a place where his isolation magnified into obsession, and his private appetites were allowed to grow without limit. From this point forward, the emperor was no longer simply a recluse. He was a man reshaping reality itself, building a kingdom where his word was not merely law, it was desire. The island of Capri had always been beautiful. Under Tiberius, it became terrifying. On Capri, the mask fell away. What had been rumor in Rome hardened into spectacle on the island. Tiberius was no longer the stern commander of legions, nor the careful steward of the empire. He became something else entirely, a man who used the vast machinery of power not to govern, but to feed his own darkest hungers. Ancient writers like Suetonius describe scenes that even they struggled to record without shuddering. In his villas, Tiberius created a world of grotesque invention. Children, both boys and girls, were brought to Capri under pretexts of education or service. They were trained for games that mocked innocence itself. Some were taught to swim between the emperor's legs in his pools, nibbling and caressing him in what he called his minnows. The very word still unsettles historians. Too small, too casual a name for something so monstrous. But the pools were only the beginning. Tiberius staged elaborate spectacles in his villas, forcing youths into group acts he called chains. He collected erotic art and manuscripts from Greece and the East, using them not as curiosities of culture, but as manuals for depravity. Paintings that once celebrated gods and heroes became blueprints for crimes. His bedchambers were decorated with explicit imagery, ensuring that every surface reminded both host and victim of what was expected. Perhaps the most chilling accounts describe the spintrii. Children, specially trained to perform for the emperor's pleasure. They were not educated in letters or virtues, but in acts so specific, so grotesque, that Latin itself lacked words for them. Their very existence was reduced to performance. Rome had long known slavery, but this was slavery transformed into something ritualistic, a theatre of corruption where human beings became props. Even hardened courtiersmen, accustomed to Rome's brutal games and gladiatorial blood, found themselves shocked. Some whispered of ceremonies that twisted Rome's sacred rites into parodies of devotion, virgins forced to desecrate their own vows. Others claimed that when Tiberius tired of his victims, he had them hurled from Capri's cliffs into the sea below, soldiers waiting to ensure none survived the fall. Modern historians debate these accounts. Were they exaggerated by enemies? Perhaps. But exaggeration itself reveals a truth. Romans believed their emperor capable of such things. In a society where gladiatorial combat and slavery were already normalized, to provoke horror required acts beyond even Rome's brutal imagination. Capri became more than an island. It was theatre and empire's moral collapse, staged daily in hidden halls and marble pools. Here was not just indulgence, but invention. Tiberius did not merely partake of vice. He engineered it, expanded it, gave it a system and a language. In him, cruelty and creativity fused into something monstrous, and through it all, the empire still functioned. Grain ships docked, armies drilled, taxes were collected. The machine of Rome turned on, even as its master transformed paradise into a stage for nightmares. The horrors of Capri did not remain confined to its cliffs. They seeped outward, poisoning the very arteries of the empire. To sustain his private kingdom, Tiberius required accomplices, and he found them in Rome's ambitious and unscrupulous elite. Young nobles seeking favor began offering their own relatives to the emperor, hoping that proximity to his desires would bring political advancement. Some became procurers, scouring the provinces for new victims to deliver to Capri. Others learned to whisper, to flatter, to anticipate what the emperor craved before he demanded it. An entire shadow economy emerged, one in which human flesh replaced gold as currency. The stories filtering back from the island grew more ghastly with each telling. Infants still nursing, noble daughters forced into degrading ceremonies, youths discarded like refuse from the cliffs. Whether every detail was true mattered less than the fact that Romans believed them. The empire's most powerful man had become a figure of such terror that the wildest rumor seemed plausible. Fear became the emperor's greatest tool. With Rome left in the hands of the Senate, Tiberius ruled instead by correspondence. Each letter that arrived from Capri carried the weight of life or death. A few carefully chosen words could condemn a senator, seize his estate, or destroy a family. Silence, too, was dangerous. When the emperor fell quiet, men wondered if the absence of orders meant their doom was already sealed. Astrologers played a central role in feeding his paranoia. Chief among them was Thrasyllus, who convinced Tiberius that the stars themselves conspired against him. Every senator became a potential traitor, every casual remark a possible omen. Rome's ruling class, once proud, now lived as prisoners of suspicion, their fates determined by an emperor staring at the heavens from an island fortress. The result was a society in which trust disintegrated. Officials who resisted the emperor's appetites were accused of treason. Families who hesitated to participate in his perversions found their property confiscated, their names erased. To survive, one had to comply, or at least appear to. Capri had become the emperor's theatre of depravity. But Rome itself was turning into a stage of fear. Its Senate reduced to actors mouthing lines of loyalty. Its citizens unsure which word or gesture might be fatal. The empire still functioned, yes, but it functioned like a body gripped by fever, moving, breathing, alive, but consumed by sickness. If Capri was the private stage of Tiberius's depravity, Rome itself became the theatre of his terror. By the late 20s AD, the emperor had discovered a new instrument of power more intoxicating than wine or flesh: the treason trial. The charge was maestas, injury to the majesty of the Roman people. Once, it had been reserved for true acts of betrayal, conspiring with enemies, inciting rebellion, undermining the empire's security. Under Tiberius, it became a net cast so wide that almost any word, gesture, or silence could be twisted into guilt. Professional informers, the delatores, rose like a new class of predators. They prowled Rome's streets and forums, listening for careless remarks, watching for subtle gestures. A raised eyebrow at the wrong time, a joke whispered too loudly. Even carrying a coin with the emperor's image into a brothel could be construed as treason. The accusation itself was enough. Conviction was nearly guaranteed. The punishments were swift and merciless. Senators were stripped of their property and executed. Families were destroyed. Wives, children, and even close friends punished alongside the accused. Some nobles chose suicide, hoping at least to spare their families from total ruin. Others continued to attend banquets and festivals, while their loved ones awaited execution, forced to smile and flatter, lest their grief be seen as disloyalty. Tiberius did not merely sign death warrants. He revelled in the cruelty of the process. He is said to have delayed verdicts deliberately, granting condemned men a flicker of hope before extinguishing it days later. Parents were forced to watch their children's executions. At times, fathers were compelled to carry out the sentences themselves, proving loyalty by destroying their own blood. The Senate, once the proud guardian of Roman liberty, collapsed into a chamber of sycophants. Senators competed to outdo each other in praising the emperor, proposing new honors, even demanding the deaths of their own colleagues to show loyalty. The great deliberative body that had once defied Hannibal now cowered before a single man, and outside the Senate halls, Roman society withered. Dinner parties became hushed affairs, where no one dared speak freely. Writers burned their own manuscripts, terrified that an old verse might be twisted into subversion. Parents warned children to guard their tongues even in sleep, lest a murmured dream be overheard and reported. Rome was still the empire of marble, still the mistress of the Mediterranean, but its soul was being hollowed out. Trust evaporated, conversation died, and the proud culture of debate that had built the Republic collapsed into silence. The law Rome's greatest gift to the world had been transformed into a weapon of paranoia. And at the center of it all sat Tiberius, not in the Senate or the Forum, but on a distant island, ruling through letters, suspicions, and the machinery of fear. By the 30s AD, the Emperor of Rome had become almost unrecognizable. Once a disciplined general with a stern dignity, Tiberius now seemed a grotesque shadow of himself. Ancient writers describe his face marred by sores and blemishes, the result of disease and the endless ointments he used to conceal them. His baldness was hidden beneath wigs, his pallor beneath heavy makeup. The emperor who had once marched proudly at the head of legions now resembled a weary satyr, hunched and suspicious, lurking in his island lair. His paranoia grew as his body decayed. Food was tasted by prisoners before he dared eat. Guards surrounded him constantly, not just at night, but even as he bathed. He trusted no one, not family, not senators, not even the men who had risen by his favor. What had once been bitterness was now obsession. Capri was less a palace than a fortress, and its master more captive than king. During these years, Tiberius increasingly leaned on the Praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a man as ambitious as he was ruthless. Sejanus acted as the emperor's voice in Rome, overseeing trials, executions, and purges. For a time, he seemed untouchable, the second ruler of the empire in all but name. Senators bowed to him as they once had to Tiberius, and whispers spread that Sejanus might even marry into the imperial family and seize power outright. But Tiberius, true to his nature, trusted only until suspicion poisoned the bond. In 31 AD, in one of the most shocking reversals of the reign, the emperor turned on his prefect. From Capri, he orchestrated Sejanus's downfall with cold precision. The once mighty minister was summoned to the Senate, expecting new honors, only to be condemned instead. He was executed on the spot, his statues torn down, his memory cursed. The purge that followed was devastating. Anyone who had aligned with Sejanus' friends, allies, even distant associates, was marked for death. Families were destroyed in waves, estates confiscated, children executed alongside parents. One particularly horrific case recorded by Roman writers describes a young girl sentenced to die, though Roman law forbade the execution of virgins. To satisfy legal custom, the executioner raped her before carrying out the sentence. If Capri had revealed Tiberius's lusts, the fall of Sejanus revealed the full reach of his cruelty. He ruled now by paranoia alone, crushing allies as ruthlessly as enemies, watching Rome bleed itself dry through purges and denunciations. And though his physical appetites may have waned with age, his taste for suffering only sharpened. From his island, Tiberius would occasionally make brief excursions to the mainland. These visits, far from reassuring, spread dread wherever he appeared. Communities scrambled to hide their young. They're beautiful. They're outspoken. The emperor's passage resembled the march of a plague leaving fear suspicion, and death in its wake. The man who had once been a general of Rome now seemed more like a phantom, diseased in body, poisoned in spirit, a figure both pitied and loathed. Yet despite his decay, his power remained absolute. Rome was still chained to Capri, ruled by letters, whispers, and a sovereign whose greatest pleasure was cruelty itself. By the early 30s AD, Tiberius's rule was no longer judged solely by the horrors of Capri or the purges in Rome. His reign had become a cloud that darkened every corner of Roman life. The empire still functioned on the surface. Taxes were collected, roads maintained, borders defended, but beneath that facade, a deeper rot had set in. Ancient historians wrestled with the enormity of what was happening. Tacitus, usually so controlled in his writing, could barely contain his disgust. Suetonius, prone to sensationalism, described acts so disturbing that later generations wondered if they could possibly be true. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, painted a picture consistent in its broad strokes. Cruelty, paranoia, and perversion had become state policy. The sheer consistency of these accounts, despite political bias and stylistic differences, suggests that whatever the exaggerations, the essence was real. Modern readers might be tempted to diagnose Tiberius sadistic personality disorder, paranoid delusions, perhaps lead poisoning, or the slow decay of a sexually transmitted disease. Yet these labels cannot capture the full horror. Tiberius was not merely ill, he was empowered, and power magnified every impulse, allowing grief to become cruelty, paranoia to become policy, desire to become law. The consequences rippled far beyond Capri. Roman law itself was twisted. Maestas. Trials stretched the concept of treason until it included any act, any word, any silence that displeased the emperor. Even the dead were not safe. Tiberius prosecuted corpses, confiscating estates, erasing names from memorials. Children were punished for mourning too openly. Justice, once Rome's proudest export, became indistinguishable from terror. Art and literature withered. Poets and historians turned to safe myths, retreating from contemporary commentary. Private writings were burned before they could be used as evidence. Where Augustus's reign had seen a golden age of poetry and architecture, Tiberius's rule created a vacuum, a silence born of fear. Religion, too, was poisoned. Romans had long believed that their gods upheld the state when honored properly, but Tiberius's perversions of sacred rituals virgins forced into desecration, ceremonies twisted into debauchery, convinced many that divine wrath now hung over Rome. Earthquakes, fires, and floods during his reign were interpreted as omens of divine anger. Some mystery cults went underground, refusing to risk the corruption of their rites. Even the economy bore scars. Confiscations of property filled the imperial treasury, but crippled entrepreneurial spirit. Families hid their wealth, afraid that prosperity might draw imperial attention. Investment withered. Success itself became dangerous. A parasitic class of informers flourished, feeding off destruction rather than creation. Diplomacy suffered as well. Ambassadors waited years for audiences that never came, fearful that approaching Capri might mean death rather than alliance. Allied kings kept their children in Rome as guests, effectively hostages. On the eastern frontier, the Parthians watched in astonishment as the empire consumed itself in suspicion. Rome remained powerful, but its moral authority, the sense that it embodied law, order, and civilization, was dissolving. Most haunting of all was the psychological impact. Families no longer trusted one another. Dinner parties, once full of argument and wit, fell silent. Parents taught their children to whisper carefully, even in dreams. The Republic's tradition of debate, the empire's culture of conversation, withered into a silence that was as suffocating as any prison. Rome still looked like the empire Augustus had built: marble, order, power stretching across the Mediterranean. But beneath the marble was something hollow. An emperor on an island, rotting in body and spirit, had managed to corrupt not only politics, but culture, religion, economy, and even thought itself. This was the true legacy of madness, not only the crimes of Capri, but the poison that spread through every vein of the Roman world. By the mid-30s AD, Tiberius was an old man, over 70, yet still feared as though he were immortal. His desires may have dulled with age, but his paranoia sharpened. Obsessed with omens, he clung to his astrologers, demanding daily readings of the stars. Anyone who predicted his death was executed. Yet in the same breath, he seemed to court death, daring it to come. The man who had hidden on Capri for years now occasionally appeared on the mainland, and each visit was like the passing of a plague. Towns emptied, families hid their children. Whispers spread that the emperor hunted not just bodies, but souls. His body was failing. Ancient writers describe him as skeletal, his skin blotched and swollen, his breath foul, his voice raspy with age. Yet even on his deathbed, his cruelty did not wane. He continued to sign orders of execution, continued to plot against enemies real and imagined. Fear radiated from Capri, even as the emperor himself grew too weak to stand. On March 16th, 37 AD, Tiberius died. The official story said natural causes. Others whispered that Macro, the Praetorian prefect, smothered him to clear the way for Caligula's succession. Still others claimed Tiberius revived after being pronounced dead, only to be finally suffocated with a blanket by those too terrified to let him linger. Whatever the truth, the end of his reign came not with dignity, but with the same aura of suspicion that had defined his life. The news reached Rome, and the city erupted. Not in mourning, but in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," demanding that his body be thrown into the river like that of a criminal. For 23 years, they had lived in his shadow. Now they sought to wash away the stain with the river's current. Bonfires lit the night sky. Songs mocked his memory. The people who had once bowed in silence now cheered his death openly. The Senate, freed from decades of terror, debated how to handle his legacy. Unlike Augustus, who had been deified at once, Tiberius received hesitation, even contempt. Only the intervention of Caligula, eager to secure his legitimacy, ensured that the emperor was granted the minimal rights due his station. Even then, they were perfunctory, stripped of genuine respect. His funeral was marked less by mourning than by relief. The irony was bitter. The man who had ruled the greatest empire in the world, whose word had been law, died despised, unwept, his name cursed in the streets. He left behind no legacy of monuments, no golden age of literature, no peace or prosperity that could outweigh his cruelty. What he left Rome was fear, and a wound that no river could cleanse. The empire continued, but something vital had been broken. Rome had learned that an emperor could be not just flawed, but monstrous. And once that knowledge existed, it could not be unlearned. The death of Tiberius did not erase his shadow. Capri remained, its cliffs still beautiful, its villas still standing like silent witnesses. To later emperors, the island was a cursed place, visited occasionally, but never again turned into a permanent seat of power. It was as if the stones themselves had absorbed the memory of what had happened there. Historians have debated for centuries whether the ancient accounts exaggerated his crimes. Tacitus and Suetonius, after all, wrote with their own agendas, and Roman historians often delighted in blackening reputations. Yet the consistency of their testimony, the sheer number of stories, and the atmosphere of terror recorded even in official documents suggests that if exaggeration occurred, it only magnified an already monstrous reality. The Romans themselves believed it. And in history, belief can wound as deeply as truth. But Tiberius's reign was not merely about one man's corruption. It revealed something more disturbing: how entire systems can enable evil. The emperor could not have acted alone. He needed procurers to supply victims, guards to enforce silence, senators to legislate terror, informers to whisper into the dark. Each man who chose survival over conscience, profit over principle, allowed the machine to turn. Evil on this scale is never the work of a single monster, but of many hands willing to carry out orders. The warning is not confined to Rome. Tiberius showed how civilization itself can wither when law is perverted, when fear replaces trust, when beauty masks horror. Capri was paradise azure seas, fragrant gardens, marble palaces, and yet it was there that some of the darkest chapters of human cruelty unfolded. It reminds us that evil does not always wear a grim face or dwell in shadow. Sometimes it flourishes in sunlight, on balconies overlooking the Mediterranean. The Romans never forgot. For generations, emperors were judged against the standard of Tiberius's depravity. His name became a byword for perversion, his reign a cautionary tale whispered in Senate halls and classrooms alike. Parents frightened children with stories of the monster of Capri. Even centuries later, his ghost haunted Roman thought, the reminder that absolute power could corrupt not just absolutely, but monstrously. And yet, in recording his crimes, Rome preserved something else: resistance. Tacitus, Suetonius, and others ensured that his victims, though nameless, were not entirely forgotten. The very act of telling the story was a form of defiance, proof that terror cannot silence history forever. Today, Capri draws millions of tourists who marvel at its beauty, unaware or unwilling to dwell on the horrors once staged there. But every shimmering sunset, every echo from the sea caves, carries the weight of memory. The island is both paradise and prison, a reminder of what happens when the restraints of law, morality, and conscience are stripped away. Tiberius died despised, but the warning he left endures. It is not merely the warning of Rome, but of all human societies, that when power is unchecked, when fear silences truth, when cruelty becomes normalized, civilization itself cracks. The monster on Capri may be dead, but the conditions that created him live on, waiting, as they always do, for the next shadow to emerge. The story of Tiberius is not only about Rome. It is about us,